Okay, welcome to our first week of the Ethics of Ambiguity, the second to last week of class. And I wanted to start today's lecture with sort of an overview of how we got here and where we're at now, because we're in a position to see that. So in designing this class, I had problems, challenges to overcome, and a story that I wanted to tell. And hopefully we see these challenges, have overcome them, and have sort of a grip of the story. So we start the class with The Stranger, which gives you, it's an easy read, it's quick, it gives you the feeling of absurdity, right? It presents the emotional problem that is core, it's at the heart of the existentialist project. Existentialists broadly construed through the 18th and 1900s, right? Christian, atheist, whatever. That this book is supposed to give you that same experience, that same intimate emotive knowledge of the problem that they're all dealing with. And then we look at Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard, who take completely different Christian tacks in responding to this problem, where we accept God, but we return the ticket, or alternatively, we take a leap of faith, right? And so we can see a Christian answer to the problem of being, to this issue of absurdity. And then we turn to Nietzsche, and Nietzsche gives us an even different sort of skew, right? So Nietzsche isn't really even concerned with the existence of God at all, but says, look, it's like how people are living in the world is a problem. How can I inspire these people to live well in spite of the dominance of this feeling of absurdity that seems to like work its way through every little nook and cranny of social experience and community. Well, we live artistically, right? Overcome nihilism, affirm, say yes to life. Somehow find your way to say yes to life. Now, as we read for today, Simone de Beauvoir accuses Nietzsche and Camus vis-a-vis Nietzsche of a kind of solipsism in this. At least for Nietzsche's part, he wants us to be able to say yes to life individually. Can we say it collectively? That'll be up to Simone. But the way that we do that is we live artistically. And so we watch the Seventh Seal, right? Because I don't think, this is maybe like a hot take, I don't really know. I don't think that any like movement of ideas, like a historical position, is worth much of anything if it doesn't produce good art, right? And so in the Seventh Seal, we see one form of the art that is produced in response to existentialism as a set of ideas, right? We see the artistic side of it. Now, like The Stranger, you get some of the art too, and we didn't read the plays or other novels of Sartre and stuff, but we can actually like see and interact with the film and what those ideas turn into when made artistic. And with all of that done, right, we have now covered sort of all of our bases. We have read Dostoevsky, we've read Nietzsche, we've read Kierkegaard. We have all of the major figures that are core existentialists, the people that are like, that called themselves existentialists for that short period that they did, are referencing. And the sort of theoretical framework that is built and baked into their arguments, not just the coping with the idea of the absurd, but citing their sources. We've read those sources, right? And so we return to Camus, and Camus gives us his answer, finally, like we've been waiting for it since the first week. And his answer is a solipsistic one, that you rebel, just fight against it as much as you can, adventure, explore, love, whatever it is. And turns out for Sartre, this doesn't seem to be enough, that we need some reason to not just fight against the absurd, but like the Buddha in response to Hinduism, we need to reduce suffering for all. And so this amounts to a kind of radicalization of freedom and responsibility, becoming aware of that, right? And to become aware likewise of the inner subjectivity of our world. And now, having read Sartre, we should see, hopefully, where some of the gaps are in that position, maybe the existentialist position generally, which is why the Ethics of Ambiguity is assigned last. It's not only one of the hardest works in terms of argument and prose that we've read, it's not only a book that you kind of have to have read everything else that we've read before it to even like have a chance to learn like what its story and message is. But it's also a capstone to everything else that we've studied, right? Because it takes all of those other ideas and it says what makes them not quite right and what we need to make them holistic, wholesome, to get it, the existentialist project, to work. And that is, as Simone de Beauvoir calls it, the ethics of ambiguity. How do we build a system of ethics for everybody from these core existentialist principles? The world is absurd. Our experience, our interaction with it affords ambiguity, which is like sort of her epistemic term for absurdity, that humankind is free radically, both in Sartre's definition of it, which she thinks is too all-encompassing, and in the more colloquial sense of freedom, which is that we have like intentions that we can act out and use to make change, substantive change in the world. And also the sternness of responsibility, right? That the actions that we make are meaning-making actions, and we have to be really careful with that responsibility. That the power that we have in being free to actualize our intentions in the world are substantive and universal. To do something is to declare it as doable for every other person in the world, right? Man is condemned to be free, says Sartre. So how do we blend all of these principles into a system of ethics that gives us a way of collectively unifying into a political body that works well in the world, that lives authentically, that sees the absurdity, overcomes it, exercises its freedom, etc. Right? And that is where we hit Simone de Beauvoir and the ethics of ambiguity. So, like we do every week, I'm curious to know what you all thought reading it. First impressions before we like actually dig in. What'd you think? Yeah, Ruby.
This is probably not the experience everyone else had, but I found her writing style extremely like fluid in a really strange way, where when I initially started to read it, or when I initially sit down and start to read any given paragraph or section, it initially doesn't, it's hard and rough to get through. I have to reread the first sentence around 5 times, and then the second sentence 3 times, and the third sentence I understand perfectly. Like, she has this way of just kind of seamlessly building on what she said previously in a way that feels really conversational and nice, and like, and I can feel that this is the, like, she writes the way she talks. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I feel like. And I don't know, it was really nice to read after the last few where I just couldn't.
Yeah.
I couldn't understand it.
Good. So she does have a kind of conversational voice, which, you're right, affords both like complexity and simplicity. So like, you're right, early on, what she says is really important for what follows, but like if you got that, then it all just kind of comes out, which is typically how conversation works, is you start with a rough idea and work your way to precision. And it, sort of like the way you described it, that like you read the first sentence more times than every other sentence that follows, and a little bit less every sentence. That's kind of my impression of the book generally too, is it starts out harder and finishes easier. Like, kind of wish she'd started with the conclusion, but then I think, well, maybe I had to read all of it for it to be that easy, but maybe that'll be your experience next week as well. Yeah, Will, Ryan, Pierce.
I don't know if anyone got this after that, but I kind of felt like when I was in like 8th grade and like I had like the textbook and you get like the little worksheet next to it and you're like looking through the textbook and filling out the worksheet. That's like how I felt like reading this. Like I like read through it and like reading back over, trying to like answer a little question, the worksheet, like what's the idea argument. I don't know, it was hard for me.
Did that work, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I it took some time, but I was able to pick things out.
Good. Yeah. Which, if you're able to do that, is evidence of like the fact of there being an argument that's cogent. A lot of her terms are terms of art, like the in itself and the for itself. These are terms that come from being in nothingness, which we did not read because they use terms, Sartre uses terms like the in itself and the for itself in that book. So this is a sort of necessary loss in reading the ethics of ambiguity, but there's still like a flow to the book that is workable through. And as I said to Ruby, I think it does get a little easier in the next half, right?
Yeah, I think there were some parts that were pretty lucid, pretty easy to follow, and then some are really difficult. I highlighted one paragraph because I just like wanted to point it out. It's on page 58. It says, it therefore implies a constant tension, inversely symmetrical with the existential and more painful tension, for if it is true that man is not, it is also true that he exists, and in order to realize his negativity positively, you have to contradict constantly Newton existence. And I highlighted it because there's just so much paradox and contradiction and like in it, and it just like I found it really interesting. I don't think this is the intention of her, but paragraphs like that have so much like positive, negative, existing, not existing, it makes it ambiguous when you're trying to read it and try to figure out what she's saying. I don't think that's the intention, but that was my experience. That's interesting.
Yeah, so ambiguity also ends up being a term of art that isn't what we mean colloquially, though her term of art I think would also fit with your idea. So her term of art is just that if, as like Sartre and Camus say, there's like the feeling of the absurd and the fact of the absurd. This is like a metaphysical statement. Simone de Beauvoir doesn't really care about that so much, like the metaphysics of the world and our relationship with it. Her enjoinder is an epistemic one where it has to do with what we know about the world and how our attempts to know the world and the world to be known by us, there's going to be a gap, right? And so at some point of drilling in, our tools become dull, right? But we still have more way to dig. And so what we do ends up being sloppy. So the kinds of beliefs that we form, the ways that we understand the world are imperfect and incomplete, and ultimately ambiguous. And the ambiguity is supposed to be like a totally thick fog, a cloud between mind and world that we can still like operate in, right? It's not like a wall. Camus Camus calls the absurd a wall. That's the title of the essay, Absurd Walls, right? For de Beauvoir, like, no, you still like work in that cloud. It's just all, who knows if it's right or wrong. And yeah, I remember the passage that you pointed out there. It struck me kind of similar to Camus' absurd logic, that there's something of that in the way that she expresses that passage, and of Kirilov's absurd logic and his suicide to express freedom. Ultimately, what I think she's saying there is that we need to do something like make a gestalt with our experience of ourselves and of the world, and like disclosing ourselves to the world being disclosed to us, that we recognize if existence precedes essence, then we are the nothing, right? Because there's nothing to define us. There's no essence that like gives us content. Whatever we do is self-determining and meaning making in that instant, and only for that instant, I suppose. And so there is like a lack of meaning, concept, essence, but we can make ourselves positive through the gestalt from the ambiguous recognition that I am a lack, I'm like nothing, there's no essential quality or nature, there's no humanity in me, I'm just like a thing. But I'm a thing with freedom and the power to like self-realize, self-actualize, and to do so authentically, which will involve willing in such a way that's consistent with everybody else's willing freely as well. But one needs to perform this gestalt because it's the same object on the horizon, right? The nothing is on a horizon of possibility, that it can become anything that the free will is able to realize through it. And so the gestalt is a psychological term in perception and in mind too. Has anybody, you know, the duck rabbit?
Old lady, young lady.
Old lady, young lady, duck rabbit.
Faces.
So is this, can you guys see this online? Is there anything inappropriate? No, good. That would be unfortunate. Look at this duck. Or is it? What does anybody see a duck? Does anybody see a rabbit? And then whoever saw the rabbit, can you see the duck? Can you see the rabbit? Can you see them both at the same time? Oh, that's controversial. Yeah, it's typically already that you can't see both at the same time, that you have to like choose. So anyways, the idea of gestalt is that you use the lines as objects on a background, and then you can like switch the background to the object and the object to the background. So like you make the ears the beak or the beak the ears kind of thing. And the gestalt is this like psychic action where you perceive something differently, right? So the gestalt, existentially speaking, how do I get rid of this? Go away. Yes. How about duck rabbit and Wittgenstein? Kind of want a duck rabbit tattoo. The gestalt that we need to make is to see ourselves as what, like when we are disclosed to ourselves in the world, like we recognize, oh yeah, here I am, this thing without essence. We exist on the horizon of possibility. Through the use of free action, free will, we can realize any possibility as ourselves. And then what you do is you gestalt from like, I am this negative lack to I'm this positive thing that can like self-realize or actualize through the use of free will. So you perform that gestalt, and then all of a sudden you see yourself as a lack, though this like positive object of possibility through which the use of free will meaning makes and gives reason to or whatever. And then that activity is going to involve certain principles so that it can become an ethical one, not just a benign, neutral, equally absurd and ambiguous action, or a stern rebellion, or just like something that happens to us, as Sartre might say, but like something we choose. And there's like a principle of choice, why you ought to choose it and how you choose it. That again, like is respecting everybody's freedom and their horizons and all that as well. So there you go. And Pierce.
It was just very cryptic reading it for me, like kind of reminded me of taking deductive logic, in that I would like not get it and I'd go back and I'd be like, well, this kind of makes sense. And then I would think I understood it, and I read like a passage and like that does not make sense at all. And then you just explained it and I'm like, oh, okay, so I got it, most of it, so I kind of understand it, but now I'm probably gonna go to the lecture and be like, oh, I don't understand this at all.
Yeah.
It's kind of like
Yeah. So I've read this 5 times now. And this time I had Ruby's experience. I found it conversational and fun and easy-ish, easy-ish, not easy, but like not tooth grinding like the fourth time I read it. So I don't know, it might just be like a mood thing. Maybe you gotta just have the right amount of caffeine and lack of sleep, like just hit that perfect balance. The teeter totters right at the level of existentialist thought, and I don't know.
I think for me, the tipping point was my ADHD meds. When those kicked in, I was like, oh, I'm on it.
It helps. It does help. Yeah.
Microdose meth is the key to.
Oh, yeah. I mean, let's be honest, we all do it.
Okay, so one last bit of administrative stuff is we're like almost done with class. I think grades are due August 15th. So if you don't have an A yet, earn it, right? There's no deadlines except for like the final deadline. So you can do old work. If you need help or a plan to like get work done, reach out to me. I'm happy to like help facilitate and either game my own system for you or help you to like do something wholesome for you in the last few weeks here. Whatever you need to do to succeed, it's time to start thinking like, okay, how do I numerically make this work? Recall every point is 1% of the class. And you need, I think it's 95 for an A. So earn 95 points somehow if you haven't already. And yeah, do well and prosper and all that. So thrive. Okay. Simone de Beauvoir, isn't she lovely? So Simone de Beauvoir was a young girl during World War I, and her family lost like all of their fortune. They were really rich, but they were not rich after the war. They became middle class or lower middle class, which forced her to figure out her own way in the world. So she didn't have like a dowry in this old world system of aristocracy that was very quickly breaking down. She didn't have prospects. Nobody wanted to marry her. And she had a bunch of siblings, and like her parents just couldn't take care of her because she was like third child or something in this giant family that had lost all of its money and was sort of devastated, not just by like the war and loss of an entire generation, but like real boots on the ground, like, oh no, what do we do? How do we make ends meet? And so she kind of just decides to figure it out for herself. Like, look, I'm not gonna thrive waiting around for you people to figure your lives out to take care of me. And so develops a can-do attitude and makes it work for herself. She's brilliant. She found herself the brightest young minds in Paris, connected herself to them, and used her relationships to sneak into university classes. She did not like officially attend university, but she scored the highest possible score on the aggregation exam, the like civil exam that you take. It's like second highest.
So Sartre.
She
Or
tied.
higher
She tied with Sartre.
Oh,
Yeah.
the article I read said he beat it.
Wasn't it
Just
on the
barely.
second attempt?
Yeah, on his second attempt. Yeah, so they tied and then he retook it. And so other fun fact to do with like just like everybody brilliant from the European 40s were in these classes. Simone Weil, who were our reading group, she was in these classes too. And Simone de Beauvoir says of Simone Weil, if anybody was going to be smarter than me in these classes, I'm glad it was her. Right. So there's our hidden third link to all of this. She grew up Catholic, but very quickly gave up, like in her teen years, gave up her religion and became pretty starkly atheistic in sort of like a Marxist atheistic spirit. But she disparages Marxism, not all of it. Like she is, if she had to be put into any kind of box that isn't actually her own, which is unfair, but like she would probably be closest a closest fit to the Marxist box. She was a bisexual intellectual hero and partner of Sartre her whole life long. We talked about the rumor last week. And she's a feminist hero too. She invents second wave feminism. One is not born but becomes a woman, says Simone de Beauvoir. She is, I think it's at the end here, that the gender sex distinction comes from this quote, which she's credited with. It's a matter of like interpretation if that's exactly how she meant it, but like, I mean, that's pretty much how she meant it. So like gender is a social construct, gender and sex come apart. These are de Beauvoir's innovations for feminism, and in fact does a whole bunch of really cool stuff in the inventing of second wave feminism using existentialist principles to come to understand the plight of the modern woman and a way forward that didn't call on the disparagement and often phallic destruction of men, which was like a big theme in European first wave feminism. Like, let's snip off their penises was kind of like a pretty popular thing. Simone de Beauvoir says, look, men and women are not equal, and we don't want them to be equal either, because like everybody's different, right? That you become the gender that you are through social experience, and what we become is unique and identifiable to each of us, and so we need to respect that, right? And so if we force the idea that all people are equal, then this causes its own kind of discrimination. That's no good. There's like this existentialist take on the othering of women by men, right? Like men are the ones who rule the world and women are those other people that, you know, are also there. The othering, treating women as not a part of like the power class of the day in the world was called out by de Beauvoir, right? And she says, look, we treat the people that we don't want around as not people by othering them, by making them not like ourselves. And what we need to do is respect the other, right? We need to see the other as an authentic, dignified human in their own way, as like their own free entity, and to not reduce them or to reduce ourselves. If we read the Ethics and Ambiguity closely, she accuses women in the modern day of subjecting themselves to the social forms, you know, think like 1950s Mad Men-esque housewife kind of archetype, right? Like this kind of person, that women choose to do that because they're not slaves, right? They're not, you know, being forced into the gladiator pits with sword and particularly empty bowels. No, like they're a part of society and they have freedom, and yet they choose to live that way. And so like there's a way in which we like can subject ourselves to this way of living that strips us of freedom, which is not good either, and thus we like other ourselves. And she's saying, no, like express your freedom, be yourself, and you know, don't cow to the man, literally. Pierce.
Well, this is more of a question for you on like your take. Do you think that she was able to like develop this idea of like gender because she did like somewhat ascend, like ascend past it by like being accepted by like the like peer group a bit more? It's like she was able to kind of like see that.
I think that's maybe without making a judgment, it sounds kind of chauvinistic in that like it's only because of the overcoming of the white men that like she did. I don't know if that is necessarily like maybe it plays a part. My thought is that if anything, her widespread acceptance and like social power and the influence of her work is because of that, right? That like she engenders herself and then like rises above and then knows to speak their language. So like in Ethics of Ambiguity, she's like saying he and him, the lover is always a him and the woman is the one who loves, right? So she's like taking as object or as subject the man, right? It is a gendered subject that the narrator of her ideas is targeting, because if you read like, oh, and the lover loves her, blah, 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 then you would like bring other concepts to bear having read that at the time. So no, I don't think that her like overcoming white European patriarchy was like the reason for her insight and power. I think that it like just aided it, right? It like, if you want to convince the world, you need to speak the world's language. You need to give the world what it needs. Nietzsche says this of genius, that the genius is not just someone who like has this powerful idea, this transfigurable, transformative value to offer the world, but it's also value the world needs because they accept it, right? And so if anything, I think she knew how to get her point to be heard. So yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah, cool. She didn't like the term feminist. She only called herself an existentialist for like a week, basically. And similar with feminists, because feminism was largely associated with the first wave stuff, which she was not cool with on ideological and political grounds. And so only very late in her life to say, okay, yeah, if feminism is now kind of transitioned into what I invented, then okay, I'm a feminist, I suppose, which is kind of badass, right? To like invent a whole new way of thinking about things and then deny the like your participation in that conversation until the conversation has matured to your level, which takes, you know, a generation or two or three. And then she's like, all right, you met me here. That's kind of neat. And as an existentialist, she felt a conversion during the war period where she could no longer focus on herself, on her pleasure, on her happiness. And this is a comment that I think is in some ways a dig at Camus. It's like, look, I can't focus on myself anymore and trying to resolve the absurd in overcoming and rebelling, whatever. I just saw the entire world destroy itself brutally. And so all of my energies and efforts are now going to be focused on worldly effects. I'm not gonna think about me, I'm gonna think about us, right? And that becomes like her mission project for the rest of her intellectual life. All right, so ambiguity. We've heard a lot of talk about absurdity or abandonment, the death of God, but for de Beauvoir, the condition of being a human is one of ambiguity. The absurd is there, but what matters is something more epistemic, as I described earlier in response to Ryan's question, that or comment, was that ambiguity is like the epistemic to do with knowledge, how we know things, facet of the absurd. So the absurd is an unhelpful concept, according to de Beauvoir, that inspires anguish, just makes us sad. And what good is that, right? Let's forget about the fact of absurdity or feelings or whatever, and consider another way through the problematic mire of being, one that affords an optimistic ethics, which is to focus on what can we know, what can we do, what's like the action-oriented perspective to take on an absurd or ambiguous state of being. What's an ethics that allows us to live well together? And so she describes this in itself and for itself relation, which are terms that come to us from Sartre's Being and Nothingness, which is a massive and terribly complex book about like 100 different topics. But the main existentialist point, one of them has to do with this like disclosure relation, like where you become aware of yourself. So the in itself is like the material object for whom essence precedes existence. It's the paper knife, right? And there's a paper knife quality to our being as well. We're material things. We have a biology and we have to eat. right? We have to put a roof over our head. But there's also, perhaps more fundamentally or not, is the for itself in us, which is this immanence for whom existence precedes essence. That's the lack, right? And there's this thing about us which is a lack. It doesn't have meaning before it does anything in the world, and it's only by doing things in the world that it declares meaning for itself. And there's this disclosure relationship where the for itself and the in itself meet one another, where they sort of say, oh, hey, there you are. When you look at yourself in the mirror and you think, there's my body, but also my mind is not quite represented completely by what I'm seeing in the mirror, right? That there is this difference, this space between what's physically represented, what's materially present, what I can say, oh yes, that's a head, it's for thinking, and here's an arm, it's for flailing about wildly, right? But then there I am, the immanent thing, the soul or whatever, the for itself, that doesn't seem to accord to any of those concepts or principles, those essences. And so we get a clash between our nothingness and our facticity, the lack that we are and the fact of our being. So the mind-body problem is something like this, right? How does the mind move the body? What's the relationship between the two? This is taking the mind-body problem to its existential roots, to our experience of the mind-body problem. The body is a determining physical force, but the nature of being is open to free actualization, the future possibility, possibility present. And this clash leads to ambiguity, right? What is that space between? How does the self, which is immanent, become determined by the self that is factual, that's a facticity, the material? How does the material take on the form of the immanent through the use of free will, right? These are open and challenging questions that we deal with every day, just sort of very complexly described in Sartre de Beauvoir. So from the very beginning, existentialism defined itself as a philosophy of ambiguity. It was by affirming the irreducible character of ambiguity that Kierkegaard opposed himself to Hegel in what's the name of the book that we read from Kierkegaard?
Fear and Trembling.
Fear and Trembling. In Fear and Trembling. Thank you. Total brain fart. And it is by this ambiguity that in our generation, Sartre and being and nothingness fundamentally defined man. That being whose being is not to be, that subjectivity which realizes itself only as a presence in the world, that engaged freedom, that's surging for the for oneself, which is immediately given to others. But it is also claimed that existentialism is a philosophy of the absurd and of despair. It encloses man in sterile anguish, in an empty subjectivity. It is incapable of furnishing him with any principle of making choices. Let him do as he pleases. Everything is permissible. In any case, the game is lost. Does not Sartre declare that man is a useless passion, that he tries in vain to realize the synthesis of the for oneself and the in oneself, to make himself God, right? Because if God is supposed to be like the representation of that immanent soul thing, the existence which precedes essence, becoming its own complete facticity, that your immanence becomes your being without any constraint. It's just like freedom for the sake of itself kind of thing. If you read Aristotle's metaphysics, it'd be something kind of like the unmoved mover, the actuality of potentiality becoming actual or something like that. In any case, the game is lost. But it is also true that the most optimistic ethics have all begun by emphasizing the element of failure involved in the condition of man. Without failure, no ethics. For a being who from the very start would be an exact coincidence with himself, a perfect plenitude, the notion of having to be would have no meaning. And I think this is a really cool point, and she develops this for the ethics generally, that ethics are only needed because we make mistakes, right? And that we only need a sense of good because we goof up and do bad things, we cause suffering, right? In ourselves and in others. And it's because there is this lack that it inspires the positive project to what can I inject to overcome this lack? And similar with the existential relationship, mind-body in itself, for itself relationship that we have through self-disclosure with the world and with ourselves, to ourselves and to the world, there is a failure involved with that, that this space of ambiguity between what is immanent and what is factual, what is material, can't ever be resolved because none of us is a god, right? We're all finite, screwed up in our own ways, amazing in our own ways as well, but there is no direct or complete version of us out there. We're always in progress, right? And that in progress admits a kind of ambiguity and a kind of failure, right? That any decision we make isn't going to solve the problem. It's not ever going to unify the projects and the fact of our continued needs, right? No one meal is going to make you stop being hungry forever, right? And so in this ambiguous space, there's a problem that desires resolution. How do we overcome it? So the failure, this ambiguity, is not, says de Beauvoir, a subjective and solipsistic endpoint, as it might be for, say, Camus. Camus doesn't care what other people think as long as you're rebelling. The ethic of quantity, right? But rather is a beginning from which an ethics might be developed. So Camus sort of gets off the boat at the point of, it's all absurd, so now what, right? De Beauvoir takes this as like a call to arms, saying, okay, if there's a failure, then we need a solution. And the solution isn't going to be stern fighting, although I wish it could be, she says, as she objects to Camus, which we'll talk about at the end of the lecture. So we get the beginnings of an ethics. So like the other existentialist, de Beauvoir believes that in the precedence of existence over essence for conscious beings, there can be no absolute outside morality, right? Because there's no essence that determines us. If there were such a thing as an absolute objective moral system, then there wouldn't ever be a problem in our self-disclosure, disclosure of self and world. There would be no ambiguity because we would always know, is my action consistent with that thing? And we never do, right? Sartre's example of the student who's like, do I help my country or do I help my mother? There's no like right answer to this question. There's no objective moral system that resolves the problem. If you are standing at the tracks with the lever in hand, you save the one person or the 5 people, or do nothing. Whatever you choose to do or omit from doing is going to cause some kind of failure in one way or another, right? No objective moral system gets us through the mire of the world, right? So the first implication of such an attitude is that the genuine man will not agree to recognize any foreign absolute. When a man projects into an ideal heaven that impossible synthesis of the for itself and the in itself, that is called God. It is because he wishes the regard of this existing being to change his existence into being. But if he agrees not to be in order to exist genuinely, he will abandon the dream of an inhuman objectivity. He will understand that it is not a matter of being right in the eyes of God, but of being right in his own eyes, and through his own eyes, the eyes of the rest of mankind. Right? It's kind of a cool statement. Like, let's not place all of our hopes on something that we can't see. Right? Let's figure it out for ourselves. Right? That's what we're doing here in the first place. And maybe if we do place our hopes on something we can't see, then we make a mistake, thinks de Beauvoir, because we convince ourselves that that thing is out there when our experience tells us everything otherwise. The experience remains problematic in spite of the postulation that the God, this like perfect unity synthesis of eminence and facticity exists. And maybe it does, but if our experience is always ambiguous, then that remains a problem to be solved. And so let's focus on that solution. I suppose we don't have to read these quotes. Her disagreement with Marxism, so it basically amounts to the postulation that there is an end of history, which is a Hegelian idea that Marx uses in his political philosophical discussion. So basically, dialectical materialism says that political and historical events rise from a series of material contradictions. So there's hungry people and people with chickens. The hungry people have money and the people with chickens don't. And so there's like a thesis, I'm hungry, antithesis, I have too much food, and then a synthesis where you give the food in exchange for the money, right? And the world of ideas is supposed to work in the same way. And like once we have sort of gone through all the iterations of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, we end up at this point where, oh, we figured it all out, right? And that was, Marx calls the point at which we figured it all out some kind of weird hybrid form of anarchy and capitalism, right? It's not like the communist project. That's just like what we have to do to get there. That's the antithesis to the destructive capitalist world that we've grown up in. But like the anarcho-capitalist world at the end of history, according to Marx, is like everybody just kind of treats everybody well, and we don't send ourselves to space at the cost of all of our employees and the rest of the world, and the structural integrity of the global economy, just for a start. But this dialectical materialism almost operates in the political minds, at least, of the Marxist-inspired communists of the day as a kind of God, as like an eminence unified with facticity, that eventually this like perfect utopic state of history and politics and even of intellect will exist. And we're working our way there. And she's like, no, that we can't rely on this thing that's out there to be the directive attitude that guides all of our political doings, because we're not there yet. And we may never get there. It might just be an endless progress towards. We got to figure out how to like work together now. We need a principle of ethics that that isn't reliant upon an already complete project, but one that's in progress, right? Where we're already failures and we're looking to fail a little bit less and hopefully to succeed a bit. Okay. Do you have thoughts on this?
I have, well, okay, two questions. One, were you saying that Marx foresaw like an anarcho-capitalist end to this? What?
Yeah, I mean, like his perspective on the end of history was that there's no like government that like tells you what to do because it's not needed.
Wouldn't that be anarcho-communism though?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like libertarian-ish in that there's not rules that tell you how to do it, but like you don't need the rules because you don't have the intentions to like take advantage or act in bad faith ever. So it's mostly like an anarchy that kind of works, and then there's a free economic exchange of goods and services. Yeah.
Starts with proletariat dictatorship, and then everyone realizes that it's so sweet, and it just like all falls apart.
Yeah, basically. So yeah, you have the, yeah, basically. You don't need all the rules. So like what Locke says of the state of nature, the reason that we need a social contract is that nobody wants to be judge, jury, and executioner, right? It's just too much work, and it kind of sucks chopping people's heads off when you decide that they looked at you the wrong way and that was against your rules. So we sign a social contract to give up our freedoms in order to build a state that takes responsibility away from us and makes it easier for us to like, you know, pursue happiness, basically.
Yeah, I think I understand the anarchism part, just
Yeah.
like I don't know how the workers would own the means of production and be capitalistic.
Well, there will
I
be
think I'm
no
getting caught
like,
up on
yeah, I don't
that.
know.
Doesn't
The
matter.
proletariat takes over the means of production.
Right, I understand that, but then it wouldn't be a system of capitalism anymore.
Yeah, there's like no ownership
Right.
or something. I'm not a
Anyways,
Marx scholar.
does any of her disagreement come from that? And I know she wasn't like when this term was popularized or like how it's used now, but like does any of her like more identity politics stuff collide with like historical materialism? Because I know a lot of people see those as kind of like incompatible a lot of the time.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I wish I could answer that question. I don't know. It's an interesting one. And I'm sure because she was hugely political, right? And an activist for women's rights, and I mean, all of her ideas, even if you disagree with them, you got to respect how powerfully consistent they are, like across the political, philosophical, and like social identity spectrum. So they're I'm certain there is an answer to that question. I just don't know what it is. Yeah. Did anybody else have thoughts about the? Yeah.
I was wondering if that is like connected to the belief that like leaving the free market alone will eventually solve its own problem.
That was the idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have, in fact, we have a really cool copy of the Adam Smith's, what's it called, the Capitalist book.
Well,
What the Nation's like a third edition. It's really old, it's falling apart, but it's in there. It's kind of cool to have it so old. But yeah, that's kind of the idea of the Capitalist project as well. But we see where both of these codified economic, eco-political, moral systems lead generally to decadence, the corruption of absolute power, and people getting hurt. Yeah, so like communism kind of didn't work every time it tried, and capitalism is not doing so great for us. Most of us, like almost all of us, 99.99% of us.
It only
Yeah.
didn't work because of,
Did you say it only didn't work because of work?
no.
Oh, I was like, that's a
It
banger.
only
if you did
doesn't
say
work because there's no ethics.
Yeah, which is an important feature of the like philosophy of capitalism, like from Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith is it's called like an impressionist. I can't remember exactly, but the idea is like imagine there's some unseen viewer who's like judging you, and if they would feel bad about what you did, then you should feel. Sentimentalism is what it's called. You have like these moral sentiments that are sort of guided and fixed by your social interaction with people, and so if like people are suffering, then you feel bad, and then you don't do that thing anymore. And yeah, so like if capitalism has become a plutocratic oligarchy to the at the cost of the many billions of people on the planet for the sake of a couple of dudes to send their phallic rockets to space, then we've probably had our system of moral sentiments. It's challenged. Yeah. Jason?
To me, it seems like similar with Sartre, the core of her disagreement with Marxism is really the existence of free will, because the Marxist believes that material conditions inform action.
Yeah.
And she believes that you can choose freely. So I don't know.
Yeah, so that's sort of the other side of it that I didn't talk about. So you're totally right that it's not just that like there's this hope against hopes that we hit the end of history and it all works out, and it will all work out because that's just the way that history works, right? We're always getting better. So there's also the idea that we're all to be measured by our ownership of property or not, and like this like material production, and that the proletarian is just one cog in a machine of the proletariat. And so the sort of material reduction of humanity to an object of production is not super cool with the existentialists. Everybody's got to have their dignity and authenticity, like individually. And so we need a system of ethics that respects people as eminences with the material side, but not just reducing them to the material. And that sort of idea had actual like political uptake and pragmatic use. As she like quotes Lenin, like, yeah, look, it doesn't matter what you do or what you are, as long as it's consistent with what I say the party is about, right? And I'll be the same way. It sort of, it not just reduces people to the material, but It cuts off the free expression of ideas because the party becomes this amorphous object that dominates thought and what's allowed to be expressed or thought or chosen because it's either good for the party or bad. Simone Weil has this essay on the abolition of all political parties, excellent essay, where she says we should abolish all political parties for exactly this reason, that the political party is only good for itself and becomes this like gluttonous mess that just wants more votes and more power, and it loses all principle. And so if we just like exercise our own will and freedom, we'll figure it out somehow. But yeah, that is a helpful addition to this conversation. Okay, so as for us, whatever the case may be, says the Beauvoir, we believe in freedom, the existentialists. Is it true that this belief must lead us to despair? We must grant this curious paradox, that from the moment a man recognizes himself as free, he is prohibited from wishing for anything. On the contrary, it appears to us that by turning towards this freedom, we're going to discover a principle of action whose range will be universal. The characteristic feature of all ethics is to consider human life as a game that can be won or lost, and to teach man the means of winning. That sounds kind of Marxist as well. It's kind of cool, but like with a little existentialist swing. So what are these win conditions, right? What is the principle under which all of humanity can win the game of human life? Well, if we are able to get a principle that works us through ambiguity, that is probably a good start. And de Beauvoir is going to say freedom is that principle. Freedom is the source from which all significations and all values spring, right? It's that thing through which, that power through which eminence makes itself meaningful. It is the original condition from which all significations of value spring. And the ambiguity arises from our conscious experience, is represented through two forms of freedom. So she makes a distinction between two kinds of freedom, and then is going to say the important one is ethical freedom. So two forms of freedom. Consciousness is insistent. It demands action and makes its own intentional and representational. So like you see objects in your mind, right? Constructions without our willing. We just see stuff. We experience stuff. We have sensations, passions, thoughts, and beliefs. They just occur, right? We don't choose to turn it off. And even when we're asleep, we dream, right? We perceive by default. But consciousness is also ambiguous. The conscious representations are incomplete. They're not an actual representation of, or an actual manifestation of the world in our mind. They are manifestations of mind about the world. And so they're from a perspective, what we represent, what we see, what we experience, which precludes self-unification of the body with the mind, of the mind with the world. And so in attempting to close this gap, come to understand what the world is, what our body is, who we are, right? Consciousness attempts to disclose the meaning of X, some experience, right? Some perception. And consciousness can also be made to bring meaning into the world, insofar as it imagines things. And it says, look, X is Y, right? It does this thing where it gathers impressions and puts them together to form ideas. This is the early modern take on it, Locke and Hume. And these are two different kinds of free expression in the world. Consciousness is free to derive meaning insofar as it perceives, it represents it, and it does so freely, spontaneously, like without restriction, except by its own, like you blink your eyes and you stop seeing for half a second. Or I suppose you don't stop seeing, you just see the inside of your eyelids for half a second. But perception is spontaneous and occurs freely without coercion, constraint. But we are also free to project meaning limitlessly through our conscious experience. We can take the objects of experience and turn them into whatever we want to see. We mold the clay or the Play-Doh into the shape that seems to make sense and accord with the rest of the world. So I see the table and I see the chairs and I see the students and I think I'm in a classroom, right? And that is a free object of consciousness that is different from just the spontaneous seeing of the table, just the spontaneous seeing of the chair, just the spontaneous seeing of the students, right? It involves a kind of active feature. And so she calls this ethical freedom. Human transcendence is vainly engulfed in the miscarried attempts of consciousness to unify itself with his being, which is a very fun sentence. But man also wills himself to be a disclosure of being. And if he coincides with this wish, he wins. For the fact is that the world becomes present by his presence in it. But the disclosure implies a perpetual tension to keep being at a certain distance, to tear oneself from the world and to assert oneself as a freedom. To wish for the disclosure of the world and to assert oneself as freedom are one and the same movement. Therefore, the man who seeks to justify his life must want freedom itself, absolutely and above everything else. So what do we make of this quote? Now knowing the kind of freedom that is important, the ethical sort, and the sort of striving, the win condition, she's called it.
I have difficulties with Sartre for the same reason. So it's more of a question, I guess. If he coincides with this wish, he wins. But the fact is that the world becomes present by his presence in it. What exactly is meant by that?
That if there's nobody to hear the tree fall in the forest, it doesn't make a sound.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. That it's only because we're hearing it that it takes on meaning. We say, oh, that was a funny sound.
It's like the intentionality kind of. Okay.
Yeah, plus a little bit of active bit because we bring to bear meaning. We don't just like hear the falling of the tree, but we fit that falling of the tree into like the narrative of the rest of our understanding of the world. That the crashing sound is of a tree. That a tree falling in the forest or a tree falling is what happens in a forest, and that makes decays into other stuff, that we understand systems, right? And that our perceptions of the world become meaningful insofar as we systematize and model on their basis. Yeah. There are other thoughts about this quote? So like Sartre, Beauvoir recommends that we will freedom for its own sake, for our own sake. So natural freedom, which is Sartre's kind, man is condemned to be free, like we can't help but to perceive and be in the world, is not enough to guarantee an ethics, says Beauvoir. And ethics are necessary, not only to live well together, but also living at all. Insofar as we exist in a social world, we have to have some set of rules that make it possible for us to get what we need, to give others what they need, to not end up self-destroying. So we're capable of limiting one another's ability to be free, of placing constraints, of either willfully or accidentally, right? You can, at any time, you could put caltrops on the highway, right? And stop people getting to work. You can limit their freedom, right? But is that something you should do? No, probably not. There might be circumstance, but I doubt it would be easy to come up with or ever happen. So the free imagination of possibility and projected meaning, right? That horizon of possibility through which the eminence can turn its facticity into meaningful actuality. Through the infinite density of existence is what enables us to work through the ambiguity of being. We cannot unify our of itself and the for itself natures ever, but we can contrive to do so by projecting a meaning that makes the leap, right? So we engage ourselves in a project that aims in that direction of unification and make that the principle of our projects. Yeah, Will.
Sorry if I'm jumping ahead a bit, but in your example of putting the guys on the road to stop the cars, how would limiting people's in that freedom's way, limiting people's freedom in that way, limit my own freedom? Like, what if I'm just like an asshole and I get pleasure from just stopping?
Yeah, good. So she doesn't address this in the first half of the book. This is like the main problem of the second half of the essay.
Okay,
but it's good that you are, because that means like the project is coming together, because that is the missing link. So the first half of the book is identifying a problem and the relevant like environmental features of that problem, right? And it's going to be in the second half of the book that she connects all the dots. And that is like the problem of connecting, like what inspires the direction of the line that connects those dots.
Okay, good. Yeah, I feel like she kind of pulled what she was being critical of Camus about, where she's just like, like you can't limit people's freedom, and I'm like, or you're like, okay, why not? Like,
Yeah.
why not limit my own?
Yeah, so that'll happen mostly next week, but it's good that you're thinking that. Okay, so we must aim ourselves at a methodology rather than at a specific point, the dialectically material end of history, at God, right? Unification in the beatific vision with the Holy Spirit, right? That it's not the end that matters for an ethics or for living well together, for the in progress quality of what it is to be a human, right? What we need is a methodology, something that satisfies the problems of that in progress spirit, right? Something that gives us an ethics that isn't something to aim for, but something that seeps through every action that we perform, a methodology, a heuristic. And we make our meaning-making activity about the transcendence of our meaning-making generally, which is done through free expression, freedom. And this is possible because being a negativity that has the power to aim at positive ends, right? You do that gestalt thing. So you recognize the ambiguity of your existence. You see yourself as a lack, as a negative thing, which is without meaning, but has this sort of force to show this like power to gestalt that meaningless being into a meaningful object. So one cannot deny being. The in itself is, and the negation has no hold over this being, this pure positivity. One does not escape this fullness. A destroyed house is a ruin. A broken chain is scrap. One attains only signification, and through it, the for itself which is projected there. The for itself carries nothingness in its heart and can be annihilated, whether in the very upsurge of its existence or through the world in which it exists. The prison is repudiated as such when the prisoner escapes. But revolt, insofar as it is a pure negative movement, remains abstract. It is fulfilled as freedom only by returning to the positive. That is, by giving itself a content through action, escape, political struggle, revolution, which should sound really similar to Camus, right? That instead of rebellion and personal response to the absurd, we have revolution. A rebellion can be done alone, a revolution takes the people, right? Human transcendence then seeks with the destruction of the given situation the whole future which will flow from its victory. Thus, just as life identified with the will to live, freedom always appears as a movement of liberation. Okay. Anybody want to interpret this one? I cheated a little bit. I explained some of it halfway through, but the slides are also on Canvas if you want to follow along. Yeah. Anybody? Yeah.
I mean, just something I noticed. I was talking about Descartes with Sartre last week, and the first sentence here seems very Cartesian to me. One cannot deny being. So it seems like they're starting from a similar point.
Yeah, that is a part of like the existentialist project, or is like the recognition of self. The just by being, world and self are disclosed to us. And like Descartes, Simone de Beauvoir's starting point is epistemic, that Descartes looks inwards. What can I know? Similarly, de Beauvoir is looking inwards, sort of almost transparently, and sees outwards, if that metaphor works, to do the same thing. What can I know? And it turns out if it's only ambiguity, but ambiguity, even if it's always there, right? We can still like point a fan at it and blow some of it away, right? And that fan is freedom. And so that should be our principle. It shouldn't be like the hidden truth in the fog that we'll never find, because it's always going to be ambiguous. but rather the principal motive of our action should be the fan freedom that blows away what fog can be blown away. That's kind of the idea there.
I think I have a question. I'll see if I can phrase it. I think the part I don't understand is, like you phrased it, that should be our principle. But if you don't have a principle yet, how can you say that should be? You see what I'm getting at here?
It might be a question similar to Will's, that how do we get from like the state of things as you present them to some positive project? How do we get the, okay, will freedom, right? We can accept the in itself, for itself distance, the ambiguity therein, the ethical quality of freedom and the spontaneous natural quality of freedom. And yet all of that doesn't give us the like movement to, okay, that's the thing that we should do. It's kind of like in ethics generally, there's this problem with like the why be moral question. So a system of ethics should not just tell you what's good, it should like motivate you to do that thing. And none really do. Virtue ethics kind of does a little bit. But seems like, if I'm hearing you right, that's a similar kind of problem. Like the why be moral, like why value freedom?
Is ought.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
I get from the is to she's saying this should be our principle.
Yeah.
Like it seems to me kind of just like a preference she has. And I mean, it seems like a pretty good preference.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I
Pretty
guess it's
good and like
to get
should.
from a preference to a like this is the way
Yeah.
we should do it. Yeah, I don't know.
So her move is going to be to say, look, the only way that we disclose the world to ourselves and likewise ourselves to ourselves is through this use of ethical freedom. And so wherever ethical freedom is limited, that's not good because that precludes disclosure. We might like lose ourselves.
So what we are is things that experience this disclosure. So the more disclosure we can get, the better. Kind of.
Yeah, and that there's an inner subjective principle to the disclosure, that our being aware of ourselves and our like ability to like make the world make sense at all depends on other people and their ability to do the same thing. And that's the argument that happens in the second half of the essay. But that is sort of like her direction.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense.
We'll see if it's a satisfying bridge of the is-ought gap. Yeah, but yeah, that'll be interesting to see next week. Okay, yeah, Pierce.
No, Josh, I was like curious for like the reason why she's saying we should. Is the argument something like when she's saying like that a purely negative movement remains abstract, that if we don't do something that's positive, we're not finding the absurd, or rather adding to the absurd? Is that kind of like?
Can you say that one more time?
When she says like, or revolt insofar as it's a purely negative movement remains abstract, is her point for saying that meaning that, okay, so if when we have freedom, if it's not positive, we're just adding to the abstract.
Yeah.
Against it. So the movement for positivity is that we're fighting against the abstract versus just making it more abstract.
Yeah.
So it's not like
That's exactly right. So like for Camus, nothing ever like resolves itself. It just all remains equally absurd. But that is not the case for de Beauvoir. She thinks that it can become clear. Like we never get the answer, but like we can know a little bit better, right? And for exactly this reason, that like revolt for its own sake doesn't really do us much good, right? We should have a revolt with principle that establishes something positive that actually does a meaning making. Does it? I feel like the Doge do a meaning making, right? Like makes meaning positively. And that is the right kind of activity to take. And again, like how we get that, how we justify that project, we're not there yet, but that is just so. And that'll be like her objection to Ken as well. Okay. Let's take 5 minutes and then come back. Did I lose the- oh, I did. So I'm gonna pause the recording and we'll take 5-minute break. Let me see. Welcome back. Okay, so we've talked about the quality of ethical freedom as being a methodology for continued and successful disclosure of the world, for meaning making, is sort of what's going to end up being the principle of de Beauvoir's ethics. So in the end, in the last bit of the first half of the book that we read for this week, de Beauvoir takes, okay, from the perspective of ethical freedom, how are other similar systems not quite living up to the standard that we want to look for? And so gives a kind of, it draws the lines around, gives the contours of what will end up being her own positive project by finding where people have not gone far enough or gone too far, right, with their own thinking. So some examples of the ways in which we can make mistakes in using our freedom is by being like the child, being like the serious man, the sub man, the adventurer, or the passionate. Okay. So all of these characters share a quality of inappropriately managing their freedom so that it either operates not at all, in vain, or ultimately unethically. So the child. The child situation is characterized by his finding himself cast into a universe which he has not helped to establish. And so, but she's like talking about herself here and using he, you know, so like, again, like using that language to communicate to her audience, which has been fashioned without him and which appears to him as an absolute to which he can only submit. When the joy of existing is strongest, when the child abandons himself to it, he feels himself protected against the risk of existence by the ceiling which human generations have built over his head. And it is by virtue of this that the child's condition is metaphysically privileged. Normally, the child escapes the anguish of freedom. He can, if he likes, be recalcitrant, lazy. His whims and his faults concern only him. He can swing in the tire under the tree all he likes. They do not weigh upon the earth. They can not make a dent in the serene order of a world which existed before him, without him, where he is in a state of security by virtue of his very insignificance. He can do with impunity as he likes. He knows that nothing can ever happen through him. Everything is already given. His acts engage nothing, not even himself. So in a lot of ways, this might be not just a critique of children, which is kind of funny to put it that way, but also,
Yeah, they've had it too good for too long.
damn kids.
Dumbass kids.
So it might also be a critique of Taoists and people who are too excited by Rousseau, where, like, you know, just be yourself, be natural, don't give yourself principles, this kind of thing. There's a sense of similarity to nihilism in it, except that the child, like, doesn't think that the world is abandoned, or like, it doesn't matter. You just like enjoy the sun, right? But to not take part in the world is the problem here, because the child is, you know, like every person is their senior and they have no power compared to the adults, right? You follow the rules and then you play and you have fun, right? But the existence for this kind of child is gratuitous, it's purposeless. We see in it the full and complete expression of natural freedom, but no mind towards the ethics of that freedom. There's no ethical freedom here. It's all just the spontaneous stuff that children do. Every action is done on a whim. The world already exists and it's crystallized, and they don't have the strength to change it. And so they take it very seriously and then think, okay, well, now what? I'm going to go play outside. So the child can't fathom the ambiguity of being yet, nor their freedom. And so they're innocent of harm and of crime, but still they're incomplete and imperfect representations of the free use of the will to be in the world, the use of this ethical freedom to meaning make for themselves, to self-actualize, to actualize the world, to actualize others through this process of disclosure. Now we also have the subman. I was so happy when I found this picture. I cannot describe the joy that this picture brought me, which
that Subway smell too?
Yeah, this lecture brought to you by Subway. Dear God. Oof, maybe I should blur that out. I feel like it adds to like the absurdity of it all. I mean, it's a very happy sandwich dabbing on a beach. It's got to be uncomfortable in that costume.
I know, it's like, it's funny because the guy underneath is probably really upset, like probably hates his life.
You can't tell. It's ambiguous.
Did you take a picture yet?
If we were to try to establish a kind of hierarchy among men, we would put those who are denuded of this living warmth on the lowest rung of the ladder. That is a very spicy take on the subman. To exist is to make oneself a lack of being. It is to cast oneself into the world. Those who occupy themselves in restraining this original movement can be considered submen. They have eyes and ears, but from their childhood on, make themselves blind and deaf, without love and without desire. This apathy manifests a fundamental fear in the face of existence, in the face of the risk and tensions which it implies. The subman rejects his passion, which is the human condition, the laceration and the failure of that drive toward being which always misses its goal, but which thereby is the very existence which he rejects. So the subman is something like the sicario who murders for the Godfather, right? Is something like the psychopath who strings up cats by their ears for whatever sick reason psychopaths do that, right? The subman is the person who in a lynch mob ties the rope to the tree and lifts the poor soul up to its noose. The subman is the person who exercises their freedom without any, just like for the sake of doing so, with no purpose, desire, ends, or aim, only for its own expression, right? It's completely selfish, a completely selfish use of freedom. They take freedom to be a simple thing, and that's all. It comes with other baggage. It doesn't come with other baggage, and what baggage it might come with, the subman either turns a blind eye towards or psychopathically doesn't feel.
Question.
Yeah.
The brother in Brothers Karamazov, I can't remember his name, but the main guy who was kind of back to ask his dad for money. Is he the
Dimitri?
sub- Yes. Is he the subman? Guy that like drag a guy out by his beard just for the hell of it.
Oh, I get it.
Fucker.
No, he's the passionate. Yeah, Dimitri is the passionate. So Dimitri doesn't do it just for the sake of like, hey, I want to see you in pain, and that's like the hedonic thought that I had in that moment, right? He has nobility, and he does that sort of thing out of nobility, right? Because the guy at the pool hall like insulted the woman that he was in love with, and that just like couldn't stand his honor, and so like Dimitri responds, and his passion is unbound, and so like he uses his freedom in a principled way, but it is in a way that also acts against like other people's free expression, and doesn't make the world a better place always. So that's where he makes his mistakes, and so he calls himself a scoundrel over another. Right?
Could the nihilist or the heathen maybe be submen?
Yeah, they're all like in a family, so these are different mistakes. But yeah, the subman isn't a nihilist because they don't think like nothing is valuable and the world should be destroyed or whatever. They don't make that kind of contradiction, which Simone de Beauvoir ultimately accuses the nihilist of making. But there's a similar kind of wantonness in the nihilist. What was the other that you said?
The heathen?
Oh, the hedonist?
Yeah.
Yeah. So heathen and hedonist are different. But for the hedonist, yeah, like a completely pure hedonist, like totally unprincipled, straightforward maximizer, does whatever they want to do in that exact moment. Hedonist, yeah, might be something like a subman, just expressing their freedom only for satisfaction. Yeah. Ruby?
just to continue the trend of naming things and asking if it counts, like our good friend Marceau.
Is Marceau a subman? Yes, I think. Or I don't, maybe he's not a subman. He might be one of these other
I would
mistakes.
think he would be.
The
I would say
adventurer.
because he didn't really care about anything that happened.
Yeah, there's like his indifference without responsibility, but still like acting and doing, I think is right. And the only reason I say like maybe not is because I can't recall if she like places Marceau in like the adventure, but I don't think so. I think it's the subman. And I think that's kind of what Camus was going for as well, which is why Marceau like is good buddies with the wife beating pimp man, and why Marceau like doesn't love his mother, and why Marceau is only really interested in having a good time with Marie, and doesn't care for the world, or it's right. So there is that quality of indifference to effect and consequence, which is essential to the subman in Marceau. And we see the we see the consequences of his actions and sort of should be reviled by them in Marceau. Yeah, good. Was there another? No? Okay. So here on the topic of Marceau, we get de Beauvoir's objection to Camus' version of the response to the problem of being, which is ultimately that it's solipsistic. Camus' problem is Nietzsche's problem. So de Beauvoir then goes on this polemic sort of argument against the adventurer, who is Camus, right? Like the adventurer is Camus taking on form. It's Camus' absurd hero, and takes a case against this person because they're too solipsistic and abstract. That what good does the quantity of rebellion do? What good does rebellion at all do for everybody else? How does your project, Camus, make World War III not happen, right? It doesn't. It might make you not commit suicide, philosophical or physical, but is it also helping everybody else around you as well? Is it committed to being in a world? And she argues no, and I think pretty convincingly. I think Camus' project is individual. And so here, at this point, I'll make an argument for Camus, and I'll say, look, if it could be that everybody did that, maybe it would work, right? Like if we could all just freely express our own passion, and the expression of that passion sort of universally didn't harm others, right? Didn't like take away resources or opportunity that was required by other people to express theirs, then it'd be great. But that's just not the real world, right? And so there's a kind of beauty and innocence, and maybe even simplicity, to Camus' picture, which de Beauvoir is saying, hey, grow up, right? We live in a world that just went through 2 wars with itself. We need something a little bit better than, okay, this is enough. This coffee is enough to get me through the day, right? And whether her project succeeds is, open to interpretation and objection as well. And so I think Camus' project is maybe more convincing in that like it feels more personal and we can all do it, as opposed to this ethics of ambiguity. However, is Camus' project too solipsistic to actually make the world a better place rather than just to get us through our days? Yeah, Pierce.
I was just like asking about your critical reading. So like should we see like the end that Camus would see as almost like a libertarian paradise, like utopia?
Yeah, something like that, right? And like to pay respect to the man himself, I mean, like he was engaged in the world and he loved people and wanted to see them live well together, and thought that it was all of these like political machinations and party politics and ethics and systems and stuff that made people disagree and hate each other, and that we needed to focus on like the things that we could love about one another. That was very much manifest in his work and his thought, and why he remained individual, because he was respecting himself and loving others in that kind of like purely ideologically libertarian way, not libertarian in the sense of economic politics, but like express yourself freely, and everybody expresses themselves too. It's just that Beauvoir, Sartre see this as childish. Yeah, and that's where they end up disagreeing and sort of split apart. But I mean, Beauvoir takes, in what we read, she takes the perspective that I do on Camus. She says, look, I wish that I could think that way. Wouldn't it be great? But after seeing the world be destroyed, I just can't. Right? I'm somehow internally bound to bring the system to a more universal social level. Even if we consider adventure in its purity, it appears to us to be satisfying only at its subjective moment, which in fact is a quite abstract moment, a moment of lucid awareness of absurdity, where one must imagine Sisyphus happy. It takes a particular kind of abstraction to imagine happiness in that moment. But in every case, Don Juan has his virus. The conquistador has their natives. The adventurer is disclosed to himself by those that he interacts with. He is forced to live in a world, right? The conquistador can't just adventure. They have to throw plague blankets into the cities and towns to do so, to make forward progress. Don Juan wants to love everybody, but it hurts his true love of Iris, right? And so the ethic of quantity seems not to win out over the quality of suffering caused by a mere and pure rebellion, too solipsistic, too subjective. The passionate. Does anybody know who the top people are? Yeah, good, thank you. Not everybody, yeah,
Really?
yeah. Does anybody else know who Thelma and Louise are? Yeah. It's a movie you should watch. They're awesome.
Because we're all about to.
Yeah, it's
What's it
basically
called?
it's Thelma and Louise. That's like the name of the movie. It kicks ass.
This is required.
Yeah.
Required watching.
Laura Dern. How about the middle ones? You guys know? Yeah, Robert Redford for sure. And that guy who makes all those salad dressings. Nobody?
What?
The middle ones?
Butch
Okay.
Cassidy and Sundance?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, another excellent movie. And how about, okay, this is like the deep cut.
Kim Kardashian and Pete Davidson.
Yeah, basically, yeah, it's Tristan and Isolde, the love story. So like the romantic love story that we all have in our heads is like the archetype of what it is to be in love with somebody. That's Tristan and Isolde. Comes from them, Arthurian legend. So in contrast to the adventurer, the passionate person is not indifferent to the world and to others, right? The cool indifference of the world. However, the passionate person cares more for the satisfaction of their passion than for the principle of actions that they take to satisfy that passion, right? So they have a principle, but that principle is sort of singular, whereas the rebellious adventurer is just out there to live life in rebellion against the absurd in any which way, in any way that seems like the best way to do it at that time. Smoke a cigarette, drink a cup of coffee, sleep with a few extra women, whatever it ends up being. The passionate has like their one single principle that they live by, but it is still too small. The passionate person is an existentialist who forgets that one must not only be free to realize their own principle themselves, but also that the free expression of other people's principles, the social network and universal capacity of that network to freely express itself, every person as a node within it, is important as well. Tristan and Isolde love each other, but they're married to other people and they can't help but love one another, but it comes at the cost of the stability of either of their kingdoms to express their love for one another. Thelma and Louise Spoiler alert. Well, yes. Well, they have their own problematic ending, at least for themselves as well. It's an exciting ending, but it's not a terribly happy one. Okay, so a path forward. How do we avoid these problematic ways of using freedom? Well, there's no way for man to escape the ambiguity of his being in the world, right? That was established. It is in this world that he must realize himself morally. Freedom must protect itself towards its own reality through a content whose value it establishes. An end is valid only by a return to the freedom which established it and which willed itself through this end. But this will imply that the freedom is not engulfed in any goal. Neither is it to dissipate itself vainly without aiming at a goal. It is not necessary for the subject to seek to be, but it must desire that there be being. To will oneself free and to will that there be being are one and the same choice, the choice that man makes of himself as a presence in the world. So to will being is to will freedom is to will being, is to do this disclosure thing, to like come to know ourselves, to know each other, to meaning make in the world, to do this positive project, to power the fan that blows away some of the fog of ambiguity. And being is a general concept, right? Being is not just our own being, right? It's not just that like we're absurd. It's not that we're looking at the dumbbell show through the glass partition of the public phone booth. We actually recognize the person who's monkeying around on the telephone through that glass partition as another person, as a being in themselves. Through this, as Sartre called it, inner subjective disclosure of the world. So to freely will that there be being is to will the freedom of others being as well. To will oneself free is also to will others free. This is not an abstract formula. It points out to each person concrete action to be achieved, but the others are separate, even opposed. And the man of goodwill sees concrete and difficult problems arising in his relations with them, right? So like my meaning making, living in the world, if I like need to eat and there's only so much food and you need to eat too, then if I take some food, then there's less food for you. This is like the problems on the horizon. So the question becomes, if the goodwill wills the universality of freedom through being, how can we will this and still all get along, right? Because we want to disclose for ourselves, we want to meaning make for ourselves, we want to work through the world successfully, and we want everybody to do it. That's an ethics, right? The goodwill does what the goodwill ought to do, and it's only given that normative swing as long as it produces what it promises, which is like the utopic ideal of universal freedom, or kingdom of ends, or the utility world where everybody is numerically happier than they would be otherwise. I don't know, whatever gives you the end promised by that moral system. So this is what we'll get in part 2, is a consideration of how we can exercise our disclosing activity in a way that's consistent with other people, and thus derive an ethics from the very like essential quality, which almost feels ugly to say for an existentialist, but of like the activity of being, which is the disclosure of the world and the meaning making through the use of natural and ethical freedom. So next week, our last week, kind of sad. See you then.